How much do you trust the government? And how much do you think the government listens to you or cares about your opinion? Well, if you answered not very much, it turns out that you're probably not actually alone. And indeed, I would actually agree with you. And it turns out that so do many Australians, at least according to the latest Essential poll. Now, this is probably not surprising to anyone who's actually here. However, it does seem to surprise some sections of the news media. Indeed, the situation has gotten so bad that even The Guardian ran the headline, "Australians have lost so much faith in government that just being heard feels like special treatment." Now, of course, The Guardian then went on to use this as a launching pad to discuss the voice referendum and to relitigate an issue that many Australians have moved on from. The Guardian downplayed what the voice would actually do, glossing over the fact that it would give funding and access to a certain set of Australians, and it would give a special funding and a special access that no one else would have. And access plus money equals power. Only they would need to be approached in relation to government policy, and only they would have a guaranteed, constitutionally guaranteed, voice to opine on policy. No one else would be in that same situation, and therefore it would clearly give disproportionate power to one category of Australians as compared to others. However, that notwithstanding, the headline is interesting, and it derives from a recent Essential poll that looked into Australians' attitudes about the government and about Indigenous affairs. So let's dig a little bit into this and see what exactly is going on with that Essential poll and what Australians think about the government. And if you've all got any thoughts about it, well, do let me know that in the comments below. So let's start off with the main one that was of interest to me, which is how well do you think the government listens to you when making decisions? The Essential poll asked Australians, or asked their survey respondents, about how much they think the government listens to various different interest groups, such as big business or Indigenous Australians or people with disabilities, etc., etc. There were some interesting results. For example, 24% of respondents think the government is very good at listening to big business. 12% of respondents think they're very good at listening to Indigenous Australians, which seemingly, when we look at the rest of it, would suggest that maybe the Indigenous voice wasn't necessary. For example, if we look at people with disabilities, only 6% of respondents think the government is good at listening to them. Only 8% think the government is good at listening to older Australians. Only 5% think the government is good at listening to small business, which stands in stark contrast to big business. Only 5% think they're good at listening to local communities. 6% think they're good at listening to ordinary Australians, and 5% think they're good at listening to regional communities. Now let's focus on that, for example. 6% of people think the government is good at listening to ordinary Australians. That's half as many as think the government is good at listening to Indigenous Australians. This would seem to imply that the voice wouldn't have been necessary, and indeed, ordinary Australians are seemingly as much need of a voice as Indigenous Australians. That is, the voice was seemingly solving the entirely wrong problem, at least according to those survey results. It would also seem to suggest that many people think the government is just ignoring them, making decisions without considering what they want. On the other hand, if you look at people who are saying the government is very poor at listening to various constituents, well, 21% of respondents think the government is very bad at listening to ordinary Australians. By contrast, only 14% of respondents think the government is very bad at listening to Indigenous Australians, and only 5% think the government is very bad at listening to big business. Now, when we're focusing on big business, one does wonder whether that is just a function of big business seemingly throwing their weight around, perhaps lobbying with the government, perhaps trying to get their point across to the government. Or maybe it's just irritation that big business appears to be hand in hand with government, whether or not that is truly the case. Regardless, it does suggest there's a stark contrast between the relative power of these various groups, and it is astounding how much less power small business appears to have relative to big business. It would appear, therefore, that small business could be trampled over by big business. Big business arguably might in fact want more red tape, to some extent more unionization, more regulation. And the reason for that is they can bear those costs, whereas small business cannot. And therefore, if big business imposes more and more costs that only they can actually withstand, they can drive their competitors out of business. One also wonders whether that might be going on. Regardless, we can see the population doesn't seem to think the government actually listens to them and therefore would seemingly not trust the government either. Now, these results are relatively consistent across voting intentions. That is, whether someone would vote coalition or for Labour or for the Greens. However, there are some areas of difference. For example, Labour supporters seem to have much more faith in government to listen to them. For example, it's consistent across most of these splits that Labour supporters think the government listens much more to them than do coalition supporters. They would appear to have much more trust in government and government control than do coalition supporters who think the government is just running roughshod over them. There were also some interesting results in relation to Indigenous affairs, and I won't go through all of these, I'll just go through some of the highlights. For example, in relation to the question, why Indigenous Australians experience disadvantage, people were given two options. Either that the disadvantage is systemic and is a product of colonial history and ongoing discrimination, or alternatively, the disadvantage is the result of personal decisions that are being made. 58% of respondents think that the disadvantage is a result of personal decisions and is not the result of systemic racism or colonialism. But of course, there are going to be splits that might cause differences across age or gender or voting intention, which is relatively unsurprising. If we look at support for various government actions after the referendum, we can see an overall decline in the number of people who want the government to do things about Indigenous affairs. For example, if we look at the proportion of people that support beginning to work on a treaty with Indigenous Australians, well, before the referendum, 38% of people wanted to start work on a treaty. Now it's only 35%. Presumably, that would suggest that people have tired of the idea. Some people perhaps who had supported it beforehand had maybe either been educated against it, or alternatively, they'd just become rather tired of going on with an additional referendum or something similar. Furthermore, whereas before 37% of people wanted a so-called truth-telling commission, now it's only 34%. Maybe they might be concerned about the misinformation that this so-called truth-telling commission might in fact perpetuate. The number of people who want a voice also appears to have decreased a bit. For example, when survey respondents were asked about whether a voice should be brought into being through legislation, even if not enshrined in the Constitution, only 34% of people supported that. And again, only 33% of people supported recognising Indigenous Australians in the Constitution through another referendum without establishing a voice. In essence, support for many of these Indigenous proposals has decreased over time. In addition, the overwhelming majority of people do not want a so-called Makarrata Commission. Now, that Makarrata Commission clearly would be the forefront of leading toward a treaty and various other results. It would not just be a kumbaya moment where people come together and hug out their problems. Rather, it would seemingly have real power to lead toward a real-world result, notwithstanding what Anthony Albanese appears to imply. According to the Essential poll, 59% of people do not want a Makarrata Commission. By contrast, only 41% of people do want a Makarrata Commission. So if the government is actually listening to people, it should really be backing off the Makarrata Commission and should be doing so of its own volition, not dragged away from it kicking and screaming, which it appears has actually been the case. It took a long time for the government to actually sour on the Makarrata Commission and not go ahead with it. It was really forced to do so because it would have lost many, many more votes if it had failed to resile from the prior adherence to the Makarrata Commission. So in essence, what we're seeing here from the Essential poll is first, a general lack in faith in government to listen to voters' concerns, and then second, a general sense of fatigue about many of the Indigenous affairs issues that came out during the Voice referendum, and a concern perhaps that the Voice would have given rise to special powers, and people realizing this and becoming much more negative on the idea after they'd been informed about it throughout the whole Voice referendum campaign. But it does appear overall, people have simply lost faith in the government. But let me know your thoughts about it in the comments below. I'd be interested to hear if you trust the government more than some of the survey respondents seem to do.